Bangkok, where 3 of the 4 players were posted in '91. The 4th, Highsmith, was a mentor to George Bear, who is Famine in the Four Horsemen. Highsmith has always worked out of London. Tell me about Highsmith, I said. As I said, he's always been in the main office, London. He was a high-level analyst, and then actually ran several agents. He's a very bright chap, well thought of. He claimed that the Four Horsemen was just a harmless fantasy game. It may be for him, Alex. He may be telling the truth. He's been in a wheelchair since '85, automobile accident. His wife had just left him, and he cracked. He's an enormous fellow, about 300 pounds. I doubt that he's getting about and murdering young women in the scuffier neighborhoods of London. That's what you believe Schaefer was doing here in Washington, the Jane Doe murders. Jones was right, and I didn't deny it. We know he was involved in several murders, and I think we were close to catching him. He was picking up his victims in a gypsy cab. We found the cab. Yes, we knew about him, Andrew. Jones tented his thick fingers and pursed his lips. You think Schaefer knew how close you and Detective Hampton were getting? He may have known, but there was a lot of pressure on him. He made some mistakes that led us to an apartment he rented. Jones nodded. He seemed to know a great deal about Schaefer, which told me he'd been watching him too. How do you think the other game players might react to Schaefer's being so out of control? I asked. I'm fairly sure they felt threatened. Who wouldn't? He was a risk to all of them. He still is, Jones continued. So we have Schaefer, who's probably been committing murders here in Washington, acting out his fantasies in real life, and Highsmith, who probably couldn't do that, but could be a sort of controller. Then there's a man named James Whitehead in Jamaica, but there have been no murders of the Jane Doe variety on that island, or any other one nearby. We've checked thoroughly. And there's George Bear in the Far East. What about Bear? I assume you've investigated him too. Of course. There's nothing specific in his record, but there was an incident, a possible connection to follow up on. Last year in Bangkok, 2 girls who worked in a strip bar in Pat Pong disappeared. They just vanished into the noisy, teeming streets. The girls were 16 and 18 respectively, bar dancers and prostitutes. Alex, they were found nailed together in the missionary position, wearing only garters and stockings. Even in jolly old Bangkok, that caused quite a stir. Sound distressingly similar to the 2 girls who were killed in Eckington? I nodded. So, we have at least 2 unsolved Jane Does in Bangkok. Has anyone actually questioned Bear? At this point, no, but he's being watched. Remember the politics, the fear of a scandal that I mentioned earlier. There's an ongoing investigation of Bear and the others, but to some extent, our hands are tied. My hands aren't tied, I said to Jones. That's what you wanted me to say, isn't it? What you expected? It's why you met with me tonight. Jones turned very serious. It's how the world works, I'm afraid. Let's do this together from here on. If you help us, I promise to do what I can to find out what happened to Christine Johnson. It seemed impossible to predict the outcome of the trial, a fact of life I tried not to let get me down too much. Sometimes I wanted to shut my eyes tight and not have to watch another moment of the trial. I wanted things to be the way they had been before the Weasel. Catherine Fitzgibbon was doing a very good job with each witness, but the judge seemed to be favoring the defense whenever possible. It had begun at the critical suppression hearing, and it continued now. I talked things over with Andrew Jones when I got home after court that afternoon. I tried to contact Oliver Highsmith again, but so far I hadn't gotten any response. Also, there was nothing new to link Schaefer with the Jane Doe murders in Washington. Schaefer didn't seem to have murdered anyone, at least locally, in the past several months. Jeffrey Schaefer had an attractive, loving wife, and that incongruous and monstrously unfair fact bothered me a lot. I couldn't understand it, as a psychologist or as a detective. The testimony of Lucy Schaefer lasted just over an hour. Jane Halpern wanted the jury to hear about Lucy's wonderful husband. Finally, it was Catherine Fitzgibbon's turn. In her own way, she was as tough and maybe as formidable as Jules Halpern. Mrs. Schaefer, we've all been listening to you intently, and it all sounds very charming and idyllic, but I'm troubled and confused by something. Isn't it true that your husband has been treated for despair for many years? He's seeing a psychologist, Mrs. Schaefer. He suffers from manic depression, or bipolar disorder, correct? Lucy shook her head. He's had a midlife crisis. That's all it is. It's nothing unusual for men his age." "I see. And were you able to help him with this crisis?"
"Of course I was."
"Although not with respect to his work. So much of what he does is classified and top secret. You must understand that." "I must," the prosecutor said, then quickly went on. "So, your husband has a great many secrets he keeps from you." Lucy frowned, and her eyes shot darts at the wily prosecutor.
"In his work, yes."
"You knew that he was seeing Dr. Cassidy, Boo Cassidy?"
"Yes, of course I did. We often talked about it."
"How often did he see her, do you know? Did he tell you that, or was it top secret?" Jane Halpin shouted, "Objection! Sustained!" "Miss Fitzgibbon," warned Judge Fisco with an arched brow. "Sorry, Your Honor. Sorry, Lucy." "All right, then. How often did your husband see Boo Cassidy?"
He saw her as much as necessary, I suppose. I believe her name is Elizabeth."
"Once a week, twice, every day?" Fitzgibbon pressed on, without missing a beat.
"I think once a week.
Usually it was once a week. But the doormen at the Farragut testified that they saw your husband much more than that, 3-4 times a week on average." Lucy Schaefer shook her head wearily and glared at Fitzgibbon.
"I trust Jeffrey completely. I don't
keep a leash on him. I certainly wouldn't count his therapy sessions. Did you mind that Dr. Cassidy, Elizabeth, was such an attractive woman?"
"No, don't be absurd."
Fitzgibbon looked genuinely surprised. "Why is that absurd? I don't think it is. I think I'd mind if my husband was seeing an attractive woman at her home office 2, 3, 4 times a week." Fitzgibbon moved swiftly. "Didn't it bother you that Boo Cassidy was a surrogate sex therapist for your husband?" Lucy Schaefer hesitated, seemed surprised, and glanced quickly at her husband. She hadn't known. It was impossible not to feel sorry for her. Jane Halpin quickly rose from her seat. "Objection, Your Honor. There is no foundation that my client was seeing a sex surrogate." Lucy Schaefer visibly pulled herself together on the witness stand. She was clearly stronger than she looked. Was she a game player, too? Could she be one of the players? Or did she and her husband play a completely different kind of game? She spoke.
"I'd like to answer the question. Madam Prosecutor, my husband, Jeffrey, has been such a good husband, such a good father, that even if he felt it necessary to see a sex therapist and did not want to tell me about it because of the hurt and shame he felt, I would understand."
"And if he committed cold-blooded murder and did not want to tell you?" the prosecutor asked, then turned to the jury. Elizabeth Boo Cassidy was in her late 30s, slender and very attractive. She was a regular shopper at Neiman Marcus, Saks, Nordstrom's, Bloomingdale's, and various chic specialty shops around Washington. It showed. She had gotten the nickname Boo as an infant because she always laughed and laughed whenever she heard the sound of someone playing peekaboo with her. She soon learned to do it herself, muttering boo-boo, boo-boo. In school right through college, she kept the name, friends said, because she could be a little scary at times. For her important day in court, she'd chosen a single-breasted pantsuit, beautifully cut, very soft and flowy. Her outfit was an eye-pleasing mix of coffee and cashmere cream. She looked like a professional person, and a successful one. Jules Halpern asked her to state her name and her occupation for the record. He was amiable but businesslike, a little cooler than he had been with other witnesses.
"Dr. Elizabeth Cassidy, I'm a psychotherapist," she replied evenly. "Dr. Cassidy, how do you know Colonel Schaefer?" "He's a patient of mine, and has been for over a year. He sees me at my office at 1208 Woodley Avenue once or twice a week. We increased the frequency of the sessions recently."
Halpern nodded. "What time are the sessions?"
"Usually early evening. They can vary according to Mr. Schaefer's work schedule."
"Dr. Cassidy, I direct your attention to the evening of the murder of Detective Hampton. Did Jeffrey Schaefer have a therapy session with you that night?"
"Yes, he did. At 9 p.m., from 9 until 10. I think he may have arrived a little earlier that night, but the session was scheduled for 9.
"Could he have arrived as early as 8:30?
"No, that isn't possible. We were talking to each other on cell phones from the time he left his house in Colorama until he arrived at my building. He was feeling a great deal of guilt about his latest dark moods coming too close to his daughter's birthday party."
"I see. Was there any break in your conversation with Colonel Schaefer?"
"Yes, but it was a very short one." Halpern kept the pace brisk.
"How much time passed between the time the two of you stopped talking on the cell phone and his arrival at your office?"
2 or 3 minutes, 5 at the most. While he parked the car and came upstairs, no more than that. When he arrived at your office, did Jeffrey Schaefer seem unsettled in any way? No, not at all. He appeared relatively cheerful, actually. He had just hosted a successful birthday party for the twins. He felt it had gone very well. He dotes on his children. Was he out of breath, tense, or perspiring? Halpin asked. No, as I said, he was calm and looked quite fine. I remember it quite clearly, and after the intrusion by the police, I made careful notes to keep everything accurate and fresh, she said, then glanced at the prosecution table. So you made notes for the sake of accuracy? Yes, I did. Dr. Cassidy, did you notice any blood anywhere on Colonel Schaefer's clothing? No, I did not. I see. You saw no blood on Schaefer, and when Detective Cross arrived, did you see any blood on him? Yes, I saw dark stains and streaks of blood on his shirt and suit coat, also on his hands. Jules Halpin paused to let everything sink in with the jury. Then he asked a final question. Did Colonel Schaefer look as if he had just murdered someone? No, certainly not. I have nothing further, said the defense attorney. Daniel Weston did the cross-exam for the prosecution. He was 29 years old, bright, quick-witted, a rising star, and known to be a ruthless hatchet man in the prosecutor's office. Dan Weston was also good-looking, blond, and rugged. He got physically close to Boo Cassidy. They made a fetching couple, which was precisely the visual idea he wanted to communicate. Miss Cassidy, you weren't Mr. Schaefer's psychiatrist, were you? She frowned slightly, but then managed a weak smile. No, a psychiatrist has to be a medical doctor. You know that, I'm sure. And you are not a medical doctor. She shook her head. I am not. I have a doctorate in sociology. You know that, too. Are you a psychologist? Weston asked. A psychologist usually has a graduate degree in psychology, sometimes a Ph.D. Do you have a graduate degree in psychology? No, I'm a psychotherapist. I see. Where did you train to be a psychotherapist? American University. I graduated with a Ph.D. in social work. Daniel Weston kept coming at Cassidy. There was hardly a beat between answer and question. This psychotherapy office of yours at the Farragut, what sort of furnishings does it have? A couch, desk, lamp. It's basically very spare. Lots of plants, though. My patients find the atmosphere functional, but also relaxing. No box of tissues by the couch? I thought that was a must, Weston said with a wry smile. The witness was clearly annoyed now, and maybe even shaken. I take my work very seriously, Mr. Weston. So do my patients. Was Jeffrey Schaefer referred to you by someone? Actually, we met at the National Gallery, the Picasso erotic drawings exhibit. That's been covered in depth by the press. Weston nodded. Then a thin smile crossed his lips. Ah, I see. Are your sessions with Jeffrey Schaefer erotic? Do you ever discuss sex? Jules Halpin rose quickly. A regular Jules in the box. Objection! Doctor-patient privilege is confidential. The young prosecutor shrugged and flipped back his blonde curls with his hand. I'll withdraw the question, no problem. Are you a sexual surrogate? No, I am not. As I stated earlier, I am a psychotherapist. On the evening of the murder of Detective Hampton, did you and Jeffrey Schaefer discuss... Jules Halpin quickly rose again. Objection! If the prosecution is inquiring into the patient's privileged disclosures... Weston raised both arms in frustration. He smiled at the jurors, hoping they felt the same way. All right, let me see. I'll take this out of their so-called doctor-patient realm and ask you quite simply if you, Miss Cassidy, a woman, have had sexual relations with Jeffrey Schaefer, a man. Elizabeth Boo Cassidy hung her head and stared down at her lap. Daniel Weston smiled, even as Jules Halpin objected to the question and was upheld by Judge Fesco. Weston felt he had made his point. Call Detective Alex Cross. I took a deep breath, composed my mind, body, and soul, then walked up the wide center aisle of the courtroom to testify. Everyone in the room was watching me, but the only person I really saw was Jeffrey Schaefer, the Weasel. He was still playing the part of the wronged innocent man, and I wanted to bring him down. I wanted to cross-examine him myself, to ask the real questions that needed to be asked, to tell the jury about all the suppressed evidence, to bring justice down on him with all its crushing force. It was a hard thing to have worked honestly for so many years and now be accused of being a rogue cop, someone who had tampered with evidence and perhaps worse. It was ironic,
But now, maybe I would have